If anyone could find the joy in painting, it was Bob Ross. And if you look past that kind smile and easygoing manner, you'll also find a truly fascinating life story. Bob Ross is a figure of seemingly universal adoration. Young, old, rich, poor, sophisticated, ordinary, name a subset of society, and you'll find a lot of people who genuinely love him. At a glance, it seems like he never had an enemy in the world. And for all we know, he never did. Enemy is a strong word after all. Even Ross's rivalry with fellow painter Bill Alexander never became publicly vicious, but he did have his detractors. There was widespread disdain for him in the art world, and if not for him, then certainly for his approach to art. Ross was quite open about the fact that he taught methods anybody could use.
It's not traditional art, it's not fine art, and I don't try to tell anybody it is.
But for artists who see painting as a means of personal expression rather than a therapeutic exercise with set methods, Ross's approach was anathema. At the height of Ross's fame, art store owners would hide his branded art supplies in the corners of their shops, lest their regulars take offense. And even after his death, there was still some lingering resentment for Ross's teachings on art. Communities of amateur and professional artists often go back and forth on him, appreciating him for turning people on to art while bemoaning what they see as the shortcomings of his work. Bob Ross may not have been as expressive or profound as some fine artists, but only a fool would dismiss his obvious talent. It takes skill to produce a painting in less than 30 minutes, and especially one that depicts convincing scenes of nature with strong compositions and color. It's even more impressive that he created such scenes from imagination rather than life. But while Ross often painted from his mind's eye, his shows were anything but improvised. He pre-planned each season of The Joy of Painting by devising every episode's topic in advance, then created reference paintings to be used during filming. With the exception of Season 2, when a thief made off with those reference paintings, Ross had his initial work set up off camera so that he could refer to them as he painted. It was Ross's policy that the reference paintings never be shown to the audience. Each had been created without any kind of time limit, allowing him to finesse and refine them as needed. Given the time constraints of his TV show, Ross didn't often include everything from the reference painting, and he never usually got the chance to smooth out any rough edges. That said, he did seem to be aware that the third time's often the charm. Once the season was done, Ross would paint each painting again step by step for his instructional books. He labeled each copy in order of production: Kowalski, TV, and book. On The Joy of Painting, Bob Ross would periodically bring out his little rascals, animals that he'd helped to rehabilitate. Ross's love and enthusiasm for nature was quite genuine, and at the end of his life, he became involved with a public access series all about animals and trees. That series was The Adventures of Elmer and Friends, produced in Muncie, Indiana, and was intended as a song and dance show for children. Ross appeared in the pilot episode as himself, conjured up in a magic painting to tell the show's kids a story.
Just hop aboard the train of your imagination.
Sadly, by the time the cameras rolled on the pilots, Ross was too sick to travel to Muncie to film his part. He had to be recorded at his home in Florida, and he needed a wig as his hair had already fallen out due to treatment for his lymphoma. Elmer and Friends would be the last project Ross worked on before he died. The show would also be the subject of a contentious legal battle after his death. Bob Ross Incorporated aggressively pursued the producers of Elmer and Friends in court, alleging theft of intellectual property for using Ross's name and image. Though Ross had permission from the company to participate in the series, BRI demanded profits, damages, and the destruction of merchandise, even alleging that Ross himself conspired to violate his contract with them. A tape recording proved that he'd acted with permission, but the producers settled rather than pursue a countersuit. Bob Ross may have been the name, face, voice, talent, and hair at the front of The Joy of Painting, but he probably wouldn't have made it big if not for Annette Kowalski, his longtime business partner. Kowalski met Ross when she attended one of Ross's workshops. She'd been given the class as a gift from her husband Walt to help her through the loss of their child. She became instantly fascinated by her teacher's mellow, soothing persona. Together, the Kowalskis persuaded Ross to leave behind his job as a teacher and go into business with them, which led to The Joy of Painting and Bob Ross Incorporated.
He was just not into it for the money. But the Kowalskis certainly were.
The company was a four-way partnership split between the Kowalskis, Ross, and Ross's wife Jane. Jane and Walt handled the business operations, while Annette and Ross made the art. When Ross wasn't working on his television series, the pair spent a good portion of their time touring the country as teaching artists. But the stress of that arrangement and the pressures of maintaining their business nearly led the partnership to dissolve several times over the years, although Ross, at least, always held out. There was a personal factor to all this too. Ross's son Steve later alleged that the relationship between his father and Annette became a little too close.
There was an affair between my father and Annette, yes.
Steve also claimed that Ross and Jane had fought over this infidelity, but later reconciled. For their part, the Kowalskis have maintained that no affair ever took place. Annette Kowalski once described Bob Ross as a tyrant. She told NPR, "I don't want to leave the impression that he was rude or nasty. He just wanted things done his way. He was wonderful." Ross was incredibly exacting about the paints, brushes, and other art supplies sold under his name. This was partly a matter of necessity. The wet-on-wet technique Ross taught works best with firmer, drier oil paints. That said, it was also good for business. And while Ross's friends and colleagues have all maintained that his mellow persona was genuine and that he put painting and people before profits, that didn't mean Ross had no nose for making money. For example, while Bob Ross Incorporated has claimed that Ross's mentor, Bill Alexander, had encouraged Ross to start his own line of art supplies, it's been reported that Ross secretly set up his own brand while still under contract with Alexander. The revelation broke Alexander's heart when it came. He had always wanted Ross to inherit his own business. It was rare for Ross to make such decisions alone, though. He was more enthusiastic about the art than anything else, and he promised himself he wouldn't ever shout again after leaving the military. To that end, Ross often delegated difficult and unpleasant business decisions to Kowalski and her husband. Notably, Bill Alexander wasn't the only fellow artist hurt by their tactics. Floral painters Gary and Catherine Jenkins have maintained that the Kowalskis essentially stole designs from them for floral painting supplies, adding that the BRI specifically targeted them as rival product suppliers. As the joy of painting and Bob Ross Incorporated took off, Bob Ross himself sought to expand his horizons, starting work on his own nature show and a stage version of his painting series. These outside ventures didn't always sit well with the Kowalskis, though, and Ross's leeway to pursue other interests was complicated by the death of his wife.
I can remember him saying, my whole life went to hell in a handbasket.
Jane had been a partner in BRI, and her shares were equally divided among the surviving partners, leaving Ross a minority owner in his own company. The loss of control weighed heavily on him in the final months of his life, and his state of mind wasn't helped by the Kowalskis' aggressive efforts to obtain full ownership over his likeness and body of work. Even as Ross was dying of lymphoma, Steve Ross claims that his father entered into furious rows with Walt Kowalski over the future of BRI and Ross's image. To prevent the Kowalskis taking full control, Ross made several last-minute changes to his will, leaving his intellectual property rights to Steve and Ross's half-brother. But the Kowalskis still kept control of BRI after Ross's death, and they aggressively pursued the rights and properties that Ross was unwilling to give them in life. They and Steve had it out in court in 2018, years after Ross's death. A judge ruled that oral contracts Ross had given superseded other concerns, and that rights to his likeness belonged with BRI. Unable to afford an appeal, Steve reluctantly settled. Bob Ross hosted the vast majority of the Joy of Painting episodes himself. Whenever he needed to take a break, his most frequent and well-known substitute was his son Steve. But Ross also had a number of other painters come in over the show's 31 seasons, including some of his best friends, former teachers, and heroes from the art world. One frequent guest artist was Dana Jester, a longtime friend and Steve's business partner decades later. Jester was one of the only guest artists who actually shared an episode with Ross, Mountain Beauty, from season 17. And on this occasion, Ross found himself set up for some good-natured payback. Famous for beating the devil out of his brushes and sending paint and thinner everywhere, Ross found himself covered in mess when Jester copied his methods.
The camera people are overjoyed.
Okay.
Because at long last, Bob has got all the splatters.
Another guest, John Tham, was Ross's former teacher, a teacher, in fact, who had encouraged Ross to stick with landscapes instead of portraits. Tham came on to provide a basic portrait lesson, while also joking that Ross was too simple a subject for a portrait.
I had talked to John about maybe doing a portrait of me, and he said, well, that would be a little bit too simple because all he'd have to do is paint a Brillo pad and put eyes in it.
Jester and Tham remained close with Ross throughout his life, and both have been critical of Bob Ross Incorporated in the years since his death. Notably, they also taught easy-to-use methods in the vein of Ross's own classes. But Ross once gave an episode of his show over to someone quite different to any of them, Ben Stahl, a highly acclaimed painter who worked with traditional methods. Stahl spoke against easy shortcuts during his appearance on The Joy of Painting, yet despite their differences, Ross still hailed him as a master of modern American art. Bob Ross never completed high school as he dropped out during the 9th grade, but he wasn't exactly running the mean streets of Orlando. Instead, he worked with his father as a carpenter. There's no telling how good he was at woodworking, but it was during this that he accidentally lost part of his finger in a saw accident. Despite his later claims, he probably didn't call it a happy little accident back then. In fact, he lost the top part of his left index finger, even though you probably never even noticed it. The reason so few people know this is that Ross held his palette in his left hand, so unless you were really looking hard for his half finger, you'd never really see it. Some now claim that missing digit made Ross self-conscious, but he often held an animal in his left hand on camera without trying to hide it. Regardless, this injury never affected his painting. Luckily, Ross was right-handed. The only thing that Bob Ross cared about more than painting was animals. Ross began his painting show in Muncie, Indiana, and he immediately began facilitating animal rescue organizations there. Back in his home in Orlando, he turned his backyard into an animal rehabilitation center, caring for squirrels, birds, and pretty much anything else that turned up. He even had a pet crow named Midnight who had taken a bullet to a wing and could never be released back into the wild. Ross didn't need an excuse to show off animals during his painting program. During the original 11-year run of The Joy of Painting, he brought squirrels, possums, owls, robins, blue jays, chimney sweeps, and other animals onto the show. The official Bob Ross website still cashes in on this today, selling wildlife-themed brushes and offering to teach you how to paint a jaguar, for a small fee, of course.
To the viewer, Bob Ross is that happy guy who paints happier trees and clouds and rivers. To the artist, Bob Ross is a guy who paints in a very specific and unique way, wet on wet, where paint is applied on a still wet coat to create the finished piece. Ross himself began painting in Alaska and learned his technique from a famed wet-on-wet painter, Bill Alexander. The German-born Alexander appeared on public television before Ross ever did in the 1970s. Ross dedicated an episode of his Joy of Painting program in Season 2 to his teacher and mentor.
I would like to dedicate this show to my beloved friend and teacher, whom we've all watched and loved for many years on public television, Bill Alexander.
But things soured from there. By 1991, Ross wouldn't even mention Alexander by name. As for Alexander, he said, "I invented wet on wet. I trained him and he's copying me. What bothers me is not just that he betrayed me, but that he thinks he can do it better." Hard to imagine anyone being mad at Bob Chillpants Ross, but it goes to show you everyone has a rival. Someone out there probably hated Mr. Rogers, too. Bob Ross is the last guy you'd expect to be angry with anyone, but he wasn't always a soft-spoken painter. Ross was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, and made his home in Orlando. If you're wondering how a Florida man made it up to freezing Alaska, he did it the honest way, by joining the military.
I spent half my life in the military, and I used to come home, take off my little soldier hat, and put on my painter's hat.
Bob Ross enlisted in the Air Force at age 18 and was stationed in Alaska. Ross served 20 years, achieving the rank of Master Sergeant before retiring. Ross wasn't the softy we know and love during his time in the military. He explained, "I was the guy who makes you scrub the latrine, the guy who makes you make your bed, the guy who screams at you for being late to work." After Ross left the Air Force, he vowed never to yell and scream again.
Shoot, that's the joy of painting. That truly is the joy of painting.
As recognizable as his sweet voice, the afro Bob Ross sports is the stuff of legend. It's a meme in itself, but Bob's fro is as real as his rivalry with Picasso. The trademark hair is just a perm. He initially got a perm to save money. No need to waste precious cash on a haircut when it will all just grow into a big ball of awesomeness. And he hated it, but he couldn't undo his money-saving strategy. The afro became the logo for his company. His business partner Annette Kowalski said he could never, ever change his hair, and he was so mad about that. He got tired of that curly hair. Still, you can't call it a mistake.
We don't make any mistakes. We just have happy accidents. So anything that happens here, you can work with it.
Bob Ross achieved fame for his PBS show, but it didn't pay the bills. In case you forgot, PBS stands for Public Broadcasting Service, as in a nonprofit station that gets 15% of its funding from the government. So obviously Ross wasn't swimming in it as a PBS star, but he had to make something, right? Well, not really. Ross said that he never got paid for his Joy of Painting program, as in nothing. He said, "People see you on television and they think you make the same amount of money that Clint Eastwood does, but this is PBS. All these shows are done for free." Ross made his money teaching and selling books, and of course selling some of his paintings. Ross also sold videos of his painting system, which were really 3-hour workshops that went into more detail on his style.
Shake it off. And just beat the devil out of it.
In 2014, the statistical website 538 finally answered the paradox that has kept mortal man up all night. What exactly did Bob Ross paint? Joy of Painting aired 403 times. Ross only painted 381 times, since the other episodes featured guests. You know what Bob liked? Trees. A whopping 91% of his paintings contained at least one tree. And if Ross painted a tree, there's a 93% chance he'd paint a second tree, because trees shouldn't be alone, obviously.
A nice way to make a happy little evergreen? Let's give him a friend.
He only painted palm trees 2% of the time, but what do you expect? They're everywhere in Florida. He was probably sick of them. Surprisingly, for a guy known for his happy little clouds, his paintings only featured clouds 44% of the time.
And we'll go right up in here, and maybe there's a happy little cloud lives right there. And all you do is just tap.
And the only thing he hated more than palm trees were people. In his 381 paintings, only one featured a person. It was a silhouette against a tree, a lonely cowboy.
In technical terms, that's known as laziness.
Actually coming across an original Bob Ross isn't as easy as it seems. In the 381 programs he recorded, he painted 3 per show. One he painted on camera, one beforehand that he used as a guide, and one for close-ups and photography later. That means he produced 1,143 paintings during his show. Where are they? For starters, he donated most to PBS stations who auctioned them off. But if you have a lot of cash around, you can purchase an original Bob Ross, and they ain't cheap. A Ross can run over $10,000. That's a whole lot of happy trees.
Maybe these son of a guns just, there they go. Go right on off the top of the canvas here.
The reason Bob Ross became so popular wasn't a sudden interest in wet-on-wet painting. He had a unique look, and his soothing voice just sent people to their happy place.
The chickens grew up, and they became my friends.
There's something about watching a guy paint clouds and trees in a pacifying voice that relaxes people. Ross once said in an interview, "We've gotten letters from people who say they sleep better when the show is on." And that's the truth. There's this thing called Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, or ASMR. What people with ASMR get when they hear Bob Ross is the tingles, a calming, pleasing feeling that is usually associated with intercourse.
God was really having a good day when he made Alaska.
We'll let you decide if the phenomenon is real or not, preferably by listening to him alone in a darkened room.
Whew, see what happens?
When you think of the fame of Ross, you don't consider it on a global scale. Yet somehow Bob Ross has a following worldwide. There are certified Bob Ross instructors around the world, but for some reason Japan in particular took to Bob Ross. Japanese television station NHK aired The Joy of Painting twice a day for years, and despite a Japanese voiceover translation, something most foreign countries airing the show did not use, the smooth pipes and relaxing mannerisms carried over perfectly.
すっきりした。気分がいいでしょう。次に綺麗になった筆で